Have you ever stopped to think about those invisible threads, the ones connecting secret operations from the past to the big geopolitical flashpoints we see in the headlines today?
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, like imagine a partnership so deep, so woven into global security that its actions, often completely unseen, echo everywhere, from, the current conflict in Gaza to the political climate right here in the
It
US.
really does resonate.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of the most, enduring, complex, and definitely controversial intelligence alliances out there, the secret collaboration between Israel's Mossad and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA.
It's a relationship that's operated in the deepest shadows for, well, decades now, but its fingerprints, they're
Yeah.
all over some of the most significant global events of the last 50, 60 years. It's quite something, a real masterclass in covert statecraft, you could say.
Absolutely. And our mission here for this deep dive is really to get past the headlines, the sensationalism. We want to genuinely understand the why. What are the strategic drivers behind this alliance? What about the legal and ethical lines they navigate? Because they're often pretty blurry.
Right, very blurry, yeah.
And crucially, how do their joint covert actions, both the historical ones and the stuff happening now, how do they keep rippling through our world? We're talking direct links to the war in Gaza, the incredibly complex situation with Iran,
Which is constantly evolving.
constantly, and the political dynamics here in the States, the political dismay you sometimes feel, and maybe even connections to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
It's all interconnected. For this exploration, we've gathered quite a bit of material, detailed analyses from declassified documents, some really thorough historical case studies, and sharp investigative journalism.
Right.
It's a stack designed to give, hopefully, a neutral, fact-based look at it all, to provide you, the listener, with a nuanced view of a world that very few people ever get to see firsthand.
So yeah, buckle in, because the story of Mossad and the CIA, it's a powerful example of how secret actions from yesterday and today really do continue to shape our lives in ways we might not even realize.
Okay, so when we start digging into the origins of this incredibly close intelligence relationship, what strikes me is how straightforward the foundation seems. At its core, it's mutual interest in security. It sounds almost, well, simple.
It does, doesn't it? But it's profound. Both the U.S. and Israel face this really consistent overlap in the threats they perceive. Just look at the landscape.
Right.
Hostile states, the constant threat of terrorism, the nightmare scenario of nuclear proliferation spreading globally.
And now cyber warfare, too.
Exactly. The cyber dimension is huge now. So when nations share such fundamental adversaries and fears, pooling intelligence, pooling operational resources, it stops being just an option. It becomes almost an existential strategic necessity. And this isn't just some, temporary agreement they whip up when there's a crisis. The sources we looked at suggest it's really baked into the broader strategic alliance between the U.S. and Israel. We hear a lot about military aid, diplomatic ties. But this intelligence sharing piece, you could argue it's the absolute core of that relationship.
I think that's fair to say. Our sources are pretty clear on this. The Mossad CIA liaison is seen as one of the most enduring partnerships in the entire global intelligence world.
Wow.
Yeah, some analyses, even going back to 1989, noted it was second only to the U.S.-UK Five Eyes partnership.
That's huge, considering the history there.
It is. The Five Eyes nations have this deep historical and cultural alignment.
Mm.
So for the U.S.-Israel link to be ranked that highly,
Right.
it's significant. And what's really interesting is how this plays out in practice. It's way beyond just swapping reports.
Right.
We're talking regular high-level info sharing, joint planning sessions for covert ops, detailed stuff, and sometimes even executing operations together, literally side by side in the field.
So boots on the ground together, essentially. Sharing the risks, aiming for the same objectives. That implies a really high level of integration, blurring the lines maybe.
Completely. And this pragmatic calculation, this shared goal of neutralizing common threats, it often just overrides whatever political differences might crop up between Washington and Tel Aviv on other matters. It's very practical, results-driven.
That leads perfectly into how these interests and adversaries have sort of shifted over time. It's not a static thing, this alliance. It adapts. Take the Cold War, for instance.
Yeah.
What was the main focus back then for both agencies?
Oh, during the Cold War, the focus was laser-sharp for both the CIA and Mossad, containing Soviet influence in the Middle East. That was paramount.
Okay.
You had Soviet-aligned Arab nationalist regimes, think Nasser's Egypt, or the Ba'athist governments in Syria and Iraq. Both Washington and Tel Aviv saw them as major destabilizing threats.
So they worked together against them?
Absolutely. They coordinated efforts, sometimes quietly, sometimes more directly, against Soviet proxies. They actively shared intelligence on communist activities across the region.
I remember reading that Israel would give the U.S. captured Soviet gear pretty early on. That must have been invaluable intel for the Americans.
Hugely valuable. Insights into Soviet tactics, technology, stuff the U.S. couldn't easily get otherwise. It was a clear win-win.
Right.
The CIA got a crucial foothold in a region where Israel had, frankly, superior human intelligence networks, especially inside those Arab states.
And Mossad, what did they get out of it?
They got access to top-tier U.S. technical intelligence. Satellite imagery, signals, intercepts, things like that. Plus, the global reach and resources of the CIA network. Capabilities Israel just couldn't build on its own back then. It was a really symbiotic relationship, trading unique strengths.
Okay, so fast forward, the Cold War winds down, the wall comes down. How does the focus shift then? What becomes the new glue holding the partnership together?
Well, after the Cold War, the strategic focus pivoted pretty dramatically. It became all about counterterrorism and counterproliferation. This was a direct reaction to the rise of, well, a whole new set of threats.
Right.
Transnational Islamist militant groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, later ISIS, and also rogue states trying to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. Think Iran, Syria, maybe Libya at the time. These new threats created very clear, very urgent common ground for intense, ongoing collaboration.
Hezbollah specifically gets mentioned a lot in our sources as a major joint target, which makes total sense given their attacks on both U.S. and Israeli interests over the years.
Absolutely. The sources suggest the CIA really came to depend on Mossad as its, quote, single most important ally for tracking these Middle Eastern terror groups, especially the ones with deep local roots, extensive networks. Incredibly hard for outsiders like the CIA to penetrate effectively.
And Mossad valued the U.S. contribution too.
Oh, immensely. The advanced satellite tech, the signals intelligence, the sheer diplomatic clout the U.S. could bring to bear. It gave Mossad a global perspective and a technological edge they just couldn't match on their own.
So let's bring this right up to the present. How does this ongoing collaboration play out today, especially when we look at, say, the really complicated situation with Iran?
Well, connecting the dots, Iran's nuclear program became, and it still is, a top-tier shared concern for both countries, preventing Tehran from getting nuclear weapons. That has genuinely driven some of the most significant, most consequential joint operations between Mossad and the CIA.
Right. That shared threat seems to override a lot.
It really does. That pragmatic calculation neutralizing a common high-stakes threat. It frequently just pushes aside whatever political or diplomatic disagreements might pop up between the U.S. and Israel on other things. It's a constant thread running through this whole story, and it directly impacts the broader tensions we see with Iran today, and by extension, the dynamics across the Middle East, including places like Gaza.
That Iranian nuclear concern is definitely a powerful motivator.
Okay, let's rewind again, right back to the beginning.
Yeah.
When did this formal link actually start? How did it deepen over those early decades, say, the 50s through the 80s?
The formal liaison actually kicks off pretty early, back in the 1950s, not long after Israel was founded in 1948.
Okay.
A really key figure here was James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's very well-known, somewhat enigmatic chief of counterintelligence. He was instrumental in setting up that formal liaison in 1951.
51, so really early.
Really early. And this made Israel one of the very first non-NATO countries to have a direct, dedicated intelligence channel right into the CIA. That immediately gave Israel a special status within the U.S. intelligence world.
That's pretty remarkable, placing them almost alongside NATO allies from the get-go. What kind of stuff did they work on initially?
Early on, it was quite varied. Things like helping Jewish refugees with clandestine immigration. Angleton actually had some history with Jewish underground networks from post-WWII Europe.
Ah, okay. And they regularly swapped information on regional politics, just trying to get a clearer picture of the very volatile Middle East back then. As the 50s and 60s went on, it deepened. Israel proved its worth again and again, providing intel on captured Soviet weapons, Soviet advisors during the Arab-Israeli wars.
Right.
And the U.S. reciprocated with broader intelligence on Arab states, global communist movements, that kind of thing.
It sounds like it wasn't just about shared interests, though. There were some strong personal connections, too. I recall reading about Angleton's friendship with Teddy Kollek.
That was absolutely a defining feature. Angleton's close relationship with Kollek, who was an Israeli intelligence officer before he became the famous mayor of Jerusalem. It really set a tone of um, intimacy, mutual respect.
And that helped it survive political bumps.
Definitely. This special relationship, as it was called, was strong enough to weather major political storms like the Suez Crisis in 1956. U.S. and Israeli political interests were sharply opposed very publicly during Suez.
Right, I remember that.
But despite that friction, the intelligence ties, they quietly held firm, even strengthened behind the scenes. It showed the underlying resilience, the deep institutional roots the partnership was already developing.
So it grew beyond just personal friendships. It became institutionalized.
Exactly. By the late 70s, early 80s, under CIA directors like William Cathy, the cooperation was incredibly robust. It was routine. That 1989 analysis we mentioned earlier, it explicitly said the Mossad CIA partnership was, for decades, second only to the CIA-MI6 relationship.
Wow. Second only to the Brits.
Second only to the Brits. Think about what that means. Regular high-level meetings, a permanent CIA station in Tel Aviv with dedicated officers, direct hotlines for urgent stuff. These ties became decades-long, deeply embedded in how the U.S. intelligence community operated. It just shows how vital, how integrated this alliance had become for both sides.
Okay, so we've got the deep roots, the shared interests driving this alliance. Now let's get practical. How do these incredibly complex joint operations actually work? How are they coordinated? It can't just be a quick phone call, right?
Oh, definitely not. When Mossad and the CIA decide to work together on an operation, the coordination is, well, extremely intricate. Tasks usually get divided up based on what each agency does best, their specific strengths, their capabilities, and crucially, their legal authorities.
All right, different rules apply.
Exactly. And this happens at multiple levels. Strategically, you might have discussions between national security advisors, agency heads, but it also gets down to the nitty-gritty tactical level field officers, specialized units working together. It often starts with a detailed intelligence exchange, sharing maybe the exact location of a high-value target, or mapping out a shared goal, like sabotaging a facility or neutralizing a terrorist cell.
And then they carve up the roles based on who's best suited.
Precisely. Generally speaking, the CIA brings its powerful tech, advanced surveillance, maybe cyber tools. They bring the financial resources, which could be considerable. And often, they provide vital political cover.
Okay. And Mossad.
Mossad often brings the invaluable, on-the-ground human intelligence assets, spies, informants. They have that deep regional expertise, especially in the Middle East. And they bring a key element in covert ops, deniability.
Ah, plausible deniability.
Exactly. That strategic division of labor lets them navigate those tricky legal boundaries we talked about, and it helps maintain that crucial ability to deny involvement if things go sideways or get exposed.
There's one case that really illustrates this intricate dance perfectly. The 2008 assassination of Imad Mughia, Hezbollah's infamous operations chief. Can you walk us through how that incredibly sensitive mission played out?
Right. The Mughini assassination is widely seen as a textbook example of this kind of coordinated effort, based on accounts from multiple former U.S. intelligence officials pieced together later by journalists. It was a very tightly integrated CIA-Mossad operation.
How so?
Well, CIA spotters were tracking Mughni's movements in Damascus, Syria, sometimes for months, apparently. At the same time, Mossad operatives were positioning a bomb, specifically inside the spare tire of an SUV they knew he might walk past. Now, here's the really critical part. The bomb itself. It was reportedly built and extensively tested by the CIA, apparently at a secret facility back in North Carolina.
Built by the CIA. Why?
To ensure a controlled blast radius, they wanted to minimize collateral damage, make it as precise as possible.
Okay, so the U.S. builds the sophisticated weapon, but Israel is the one on the ground actually doing it.
That's the core of the division of labor here. On the night of the operation, Mughia walks by the SUV. The bomb is triggered remotely from Tel Aviv by Mossad agents.
From Tel Aviv, wow.
Yeah, and they were in constant, real-time communication with the CIA team who were watching Mughia on the ground in Damascus.
So the U.S. had eyes on target, Israel pushed the button remotely, based on U.S. design.
Exactly. And this setup meant the U.S. kept veto power. They could have called it off at any second. But crucially, U.S. personnel did not physically pull the trigger.
There's the plausible deniability again.
Precisely. It allowed the U.S. to convincingly deny direct involvement, even if everyone kind of suspected the truth. It's just a really vivid example of how shared goals can lead to these incredibly creative, high-stakes arrangements designed specifically to operate within those legal lines or maintain deniability.
It also shows an unbelievable level of trust and synchronization needed for something that sensitive.
Absolutely. Communication is key. Secure liaison channels, sometimes jointly staffed task forces. It's common. There have even been reports of Israeli officers working physically inside CIA facilities and vice versa for real-time coordination on particularly complex operations. Every op is different. Sometimes CIA leads, sometimes Mossad. But the theme is constant, leveraging each other's strengths. U.S. brings the global surveillance, the high-tech gear. Israel brings the unmatched regional human networks, the operational boldness. Put them together and they can pull off things neither could likely do alone.
That's a fascinating modern example. But this collaboration isn't new. Rewind to the Cold War again, and we see similar strategic drives leading to very different but equally significant covert alliances. Our sources point to two big ones: the creation of SAVAK in Iran and the Kurdish War in Iraq.
Right. During the Cold War, these joint ventures were squarely aimed at countering Soviet influence and boosting Israel's regional security. A really significant early example was the creation of Iran's secret police, SOVAK.
SAVAK, right.
Brutal reputation later on.
Indeed. But back in the 1950s, Israel saw non-Arab Iran, under the pro-Western Shah, as a potential key ally against rising Arab nationalism and Soviet expansion. So Mossad, with CIA backing and encouragement, actively helped establish and train SAVAK.
The CIA encouraged this.
Yes, a 1979 CIA report explicitly stated Mossad cooperated with the CIA in establishing the Shah's secret police, SAVAK. The goal was to cement Iran as a solid pro-Western bulwark in the region. Mossad and SAVAK then conducted joint operations against shared enemies, sharing intel on Egypt's military, tracking communist activities, that sort of thing. Okay, and what about that triangular covert war in Iraq? Supporting the Kurdish rebellion. That sounds incredibly messy.
It was extremely complex. This was a major joint operation supporting the Kurdish uprising in Iraq during the 60s and 70s. Initially, it was just Israel and Iran, under the Shah, secretly arming and advising Iraqi Kurdish fighters led by Mullah Mustafa Barzani.
Why? What was their goal?
To tie down the hostile, Soviet-backed Ba'athist regime in Baghdad. Keep them busy, drain their resources.
And then the U.S. got involved.
Yes, in 1972, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger secretly decided to back the Kurds too. They saw it as a chance to destabilize the Soviet client state and gain some regional leverage.
So the U.S. basically jumped onto an existing covert operation.
Pretty much. What resulted was this complex triangular covert operation. You had the CIA, Mossad, and SAVAK all working together, sort of.
How did that work?
The U.S., through the CIA, provided money and some light weapons. Israel provided a lot more substantial, heavy weaponry, reportedly worth $28 million, plus specialized training for the Kurds, apparently at Kissinger's direct request. And Iran provided the crucial logistical support, allowing transit through its territory. It put a huge strain on Iraq for years.
But it didn't end well for the Kurds, did it? There was a sense of betrayal.
A profound betrayal. The whole thing collapsed abruptly in 1975. The Shah cut a deal with Iraq, the Algiers Accord, and just like that, cut off all support to the Kurds overnight.
Wow, leaving them completely exposed.
Completely exposed. It blindsided the Kurdish rebels, and frankly, it blindsided their CIA and Mossad handlers, too. The Kurds were left to face brutal Iraqi reprisals alone. It was a humanitarian disaster. This episode is often used as a stark example of cynical realpolitik, of betrayal, and the often morally ambiguous, far-reaching consequences of these secret wars. This CIA-Mossad alliance, in this case, was literally running a secret war, showing how far they'd go, orchestrating geopolitics behind the scenes, leaving scars of mistrust in the region that, you could argue, linger even today.
That kind of betrayal definitely leaves scars. Okay, let's shift to another infamous chapter, the Iran-Contra affair. This sounds like a case study in how to sidestep oversight and democratic checks and balances.
Oh, Iran-Contra in the mid-'80s was absolutely a major U.S. scandal that put the clandestine Mossad CIA collaboration right under the spotlight. At its heart, it was a scheme by parts of the Reagan administration to get around congressional bans, specifically the Boland Amendment on aiding Nicaragua's Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government.
How did they get around it?
By using third countries as intermediaries. And Israel played a really key, multi-layered role as one of those third parties.
So Israel acted as a kind of cutout, doing things the U.S. was legally barred from doing directly.
Exactly. Back in 1983, CIA Director William Casey directly asked Israel to secretly supply captured PLO weapons to the Contras. Congress had capped and then banned U.S. aid, so they needed another route.
PLO weapons, captured where?
From Lebanon, after Israel's invasion. An Israeli general coordinated with U.S. figures like LT General Richard Secord to transfer hundreds of tons of these arms. The operation even had a code name, Tipped Kettle.
Tipped kettle. Okay.
The first shipment, worth about $10 million, was provided gratis by Israel, free of charge, but there was a clear, unspoken understanding that the U.S. would, quote, find a way to compensate Israel for its assistance later on, despite the legal restrictions.
And as U.S. funding for the Contras got tighter, Israel's role grew even bigger.
It did. When the Boland Amendment restrictions got even tougher in 84-85, there was a second round, tipped kettle 2. Even more Israeli arms flowed via the CIA to the Contras. Israeli officials like Mossad veteran David Kimche were meeting directly with U.S. National Security Council staff, like Oliver North, planning continued covert support.
So it was basically a quid pro quo. Israel gives weapons, the U.S. pays them back later somehow.
Essentially, yes. Weapons, even military advisors, were provided by Israel. The U.S. would repay later through extra aid, political favors, whatever. This secret deal was eventually confirmed by documents and testimony during Oliver North's trial.
And at the same time, Israel was also involved in the arms for hostages deal with Iran. That just adds another layer of complexity and political risk.
It does. It's incredibly convoluted. Israel also acted as a middleman, selling U.S.-made weapons to Iran despite a strict U.S. arms embargo against Iran at the time, and then funneling the profits from those sales to the Contras.
Why would Israel help Iran get weapons?
Well, partly it was an attempt by Israel to regain some influence with factions in Iran. Remember, Mossad had ties dating back to the Shah and Savak. And partly, it was tied to try to secure the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by groups linked to Iran. Arms dealers with Mossad connections like Yaakov Nimrodi and Al Schwimmer were key players in these transactions.
And when this whole thing blew up in 1986...
Massive political firestorm in Washington. Huge scandal. Multiple investigations, hearings, indictments. It severely damaged public trust in the Reagan administration.
So, taking a step back, what does Iran-Contra tell us about the CIA-Mossad partnership, especially regarding American democracy and oversight?
Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, Iran-Contra is a glaring illustration of how this partnership can enable secret foreign policy ventures that deliberately bypass official channels, bypass congressional oversight, even bypass explicit laws like the Boland Amendment. Israel's willingness to act as that cutout, shipping arms where the U.S. legally couldn't, was driven by shared goals, sure, but it raised huge ethical and legal questions. It fundamentally showed how these secret maneuvers can subvert democratic checks and balances, leaving Congress and the public completely in the dark about major actions taken in their name. And this has echoes even today. It feeds into that lingering political dismay in the USA, that skepticism about government secrecy and accountability, especially when things go wrong. Okay, so we've gone from physical weapons, proxies, secret arms deals. Now let's talk about how covert ops have evolved into the digital age. Operation Olympic Games, better known as Stuxnet, feels like a massive turning point. What made it such a new kind of joint action? Stuxnet was absolutely a landmark, a truly groundbreaking U.S.-Israeli cyber-sabotage campaign aimed squarely at Iran's nuclear program. What made it historic, really unprecedented, was that it was the first known instance of a cyber weapon causing physical destruction.
Physical destruction?
Difficult.
Code.
Exactly. This wasn't just about stealing data or crashing networks. Stuxnet was meticulously engineered to physically wreck Iran's uranium enrichment centrifuges, to set back their nuclear ambitions without firing a single conventional bullet. It really did usher in a whole new era of warfare.
And this wasn't just one agency acting alone. It was a collaborative effort, right? Developed by both sides.
Very much so. Our sources detail how Stuxnet was developed jointly over several years. The U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA, reportedly took the lead on coding the incredibly complex malware, while Israel, likely through its elite unit 8200 Signals Intelligence Unit, and probably Mossad too, contributed vital expertise and, crucially, the on-the-ground intelligence needed to get the code into the target systems.
And the CIA's role? Were they involved directly in the coding?
Their role was more behind the scenes, but absolutely essential. The CIA essentially lent its covert operation authority to the whole program. They provided the necessary presidential authorization, the legal framework, the oversight for the U.S. side of things, even though the NSA might have done the bulk of the heavy lifting on the technical side.
So the CIA also oversaw the infiltration plans, getting the code into the Natan's nuclear facility, which must have been incredibly secure. That suggests a human element too, not just cyber wizards.
Oh, absolutely. That's key. The critical systems at Natan's were air-gapped, meaning they weren't connected to the public internet at all.
Right, for security.
Exactly. So the malware couldn't just be emailed in or downloaded. It had to be physically introduced. Someone had to plug in an infected USB drive or somehow compromise the network from the inside.
How did they manage that?
That required spies, assets on the ground in Iran. And this is where Mossad's established network of Iranian contacts, maybe scientists, technicians, maybe even disgruntled insiders likely came into play, with CIA support for the logistics of the infiltration. It perfectly highlights that synergy, cutting-edge U.S. tech combined with Israeli regional human for that physical access.
What was the immediate impact? Did Stuxnet work? And what about the bigger picture, the strategic precedent it set?
In the short term, Stuxnet was devastatingly effective. When it finally became public knowledge around 2010, it apparently caused something like 1,000 Iranian centrifuges, maybe a fifth of their operational units at the time, to basically tear themselves apart
Oh.
by subtly manipulating their rotational speeds,
Right.
speeding them up, slowing them down, until they literally failed catastrophically. The genius, or maybe the insidious part, was that it was designed to make these failures look like routine mechanical problems, or maybe poor Iranian engineering. The goal was to string it out, cause confusion, sow distrust within the Iranian program.
And strategically,
Right.
the global impact.
Profound. Experts pretty much agree that Olympic Games officially signals the beginning of the cyber arms race in practice. It proved definitively that cyber attacks could achieve destructive physical effects, just like bombs or sabotage. And that woke everyone up. Other nations immediately started scrambling to develop their own offensive cyber capabilities.
And this is where we see direct lines to what's happening now, isn't it? Like in the war between Russia and Ukraine.
Precisely. Stuxnet fundamentally blurred the lines about what constitutes an active war in cyberspace. And countries like Russia, China, Iran, they all significantly boosted their offensive cyber programs after Stuxnet came to light. Russia, for example, has used cyber attacks relentlessly against Ukraine, targeting critical infrastructure, energy grids, government systems, often coordinated with their conventional military moves.
So Stuxnet essentially gave a green light, or at least normalized, these kinds of attacks.
You could argue it made them more thinkable, maybe more acceptable, for state actors. It legitimized a whole new domain of conflict. And that raises really serious questions about accountability, about potential blowback. When a cyber weapon like Stuxnet, even one meant to be precise, gets out into the wild, or gets reverse engineered, it can have unintended, widespread consequences globally. It fuels the very cyber arms race we see playing out today.
Okay, so Stuxnet represents the state's cutting edge in warfare, using secrecy and tech for narrative control. But now let's look at a different, maybe even more disturbing form of information warfare, especially relevant to the conflict in Gaza. Our sources describe a strategy attributed to Yahya Sinwar, which they term lives for video.
Yes, this is a truly chilling concept outlined in our source material. Yahya Sinwar, identified as the architect of the Hamas attacks on October 7th, is described as going beyond the traditional human shield tactic.
How so? What's the difference?
Well, the conventional human shield strategy is about placing military assets near civilians to deter attacks. Sinwar's innovation, as this analysis portrays it, was something far more manipulative. One source calls it a crosshair targeting system aimed at global perception.
A crosshair targeting system, what does that actually mean on the ground?
It means, according to this analysis, deliberately using terror targets and understanding the inevitable tragic civilian casualties that any military response would cause to actively guide the enemy's firepower towards whatever location or situation would produce the most potent, the most emotionally jarring video footage.
So the goal wasn't just to deter, but to actually generate footage of civilian suffering.
That's the argument presented, that Sinwar's objective was to essentially force his enemy, Israel, into situations where they would inevitably kill Palestinian civilians in the most visually devastating way possible, captured on video, thereby manipulating global opinion, turning tragedy into a powerful propaganda weapon against Israel.
The sources call this lives for video, like a new kind of transaction in warfare.
Exactly. That's the core idea presented. Historically, you have transactions like an eye for an eye, maybe land for peace. Sinwar, this analysis argues, introduced this horrifying new currency, lives for video. He allegedly understood that by embedding hostages and fighters deep within civilian infrastructure, in tunnels under densely populated areas, Israel would face an impossible choice.
A conventional military response would inevitably cause civilian deaths.
Right. And in this new calculus of information warfare, the analysis suggests the most powerful weapon isn't the rocket or the tank, it's the graphic video footage of that suffering, strategically generated for maximum global impact. He essentially weaponized the unavoidable tragedy of urban combat.
That's incredibly grim. The sources even draw a parallel to suicide by cop.
They do, and it's a disturbing but, according to the source, apt analogy. Concepts like suicide by cop, where someone intentionally provokes lethal force against themselves, seemed illogical at first, but demonstrate a kind of perverse effectiveness.
Right.
The source also brings in a Sherlock Holmes story, The Problem of Thorbridge, where a villain uses their own suicide to frame someone else for murder. The parallel drawn is to Sinwar's alleged aim to manufacture an artificial genocide narrative against Israel, even potentially at the cost of his own life, by coercing Israel into actions that produce that devastating visual evidence, regardless of Israel's actual intent.
So it's presented not just as ruthlessness, but as a kind of calculated strategic brilliance in manipulating perception.
That's the argument. While other intelligence tactics get praised for brilliance, like those Israeli pager walkie-talkie hacks against Hezbollah in 2023 that reportedly disrupted their command structure,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
this analysis argues Sinwar's approach represents a different kind of cunning, specifically in the information warfare domain, outsmarting a sophisticated enemy not with tech, but by weaponizing narrative and the visual impact of civilian casualties. The source uses the term diabolical genius, with a sort of cold admiration for the sheer manipulative insight, arguing he forced his enemy into a strategic zugzwang.
Zugzwang, the chess term, where any move you make just makes your position worse.
Exactly. Any conventional military move Israel made would produce the desired tragic video feeding the narrative Sinwar allegedly sought.
So for you, the listener, how does this concept fundamentally change how we should understand the conflict and the information war surrounding Gaza today, and the challenges for intelligence agencies trying to operate in that environment?
It forces a dramatic shift in perspective. It underscores that in modern conflicts like Gaza, the battle for narrative for global hearts and minds is as critical and potentially as strategically planned as the physical fighting itself. You have to consider that actions which seem militarily illogical might be deeply calculated for their propaganda value. It makes discerning truth from spin, from deliberate manipulation, an even more profound challenge and absolutely essential for anyone trying to make sense of it all.
Which brings us back to the state's approach to narrative control. If Sinwar's strategy, as described, is about generating media, Mossad and the CIA are masters at controlling the narrative around their own actions, right? Secrecy, as the sources say, is their lifeblood.
Absolutely. Secrecy is fundamental for covert ops to succeed, and crucially, to maintain that plausible deniability. Both agencies are incredibly skilled at this, at meticulously shaping public perception, often just by preventing information from getting out in the first place. Their methods are diverse and highly refined.
Like the simple but often very effective refusal to confirm or deny, like with the Mugnia assassination we discussed.
Exactly. Neither the U.S. nor the Israeli government ever officially took responsibility for Maghini's killing. It took, 7 years for a detailed account based on anonymous former officials to even surface in the press? That refusal to confirm allows the U.S. to avoid direct diplomatic clashes with Syria, and it lets Israel sidestep direct confrontation over violating Syrian sovereignty. Plausible deniability, in this context, means even if everyone thinks they know who did it, the lack of official confirmation gives other countries diplomatic cover to avoid escalating things. It prevents a potential regional crisis.
And they go beyond just silence, right? They use cover stories, misdirection, maybe even deliberate leaks sometimes.
Oh yes, cover stories can be incredibly elaborate: fake identities, front companies, forged documents. Mossad in particular has a reputation for mastering the use of forged foreign passports for deep cover operations. Sometimes operations might be subtly attributed to local insurgent groups or framed as accidents.
Like with Stuxnet initially. Just mysterious malfunctions.
Right. The initial public story around Stuxnet was just that Iran's centrifuges were inexplicably failing. Even when details started leaking, officials would often just point to media reports rather than confirming anything themselves. Misdirection, psychological operations, these are standard tools. And yes, even deliberate leaks can be part of the strategy.
Leaks to control the narrative.
It happens. The Obama administration, for instance, was widely suspected by some in the intelligence community of strategically leaking certain details about Stuxnet and the Muggia hit. Why? Possibly to bolster their image, to look tough on terrorism and proliferation, even though those leaks drew heavy criticism internally for potentially burning sources or methods.
So it's a real contrast with the Sinwar strategy described earlier. He allegedly creates the raw footage. They try to control the story about their actions.
It's a fundamental difference in approach to information warfare. Sinwar's alleged strategy is about generating the immediate, visceral visual narrative to compel a global reaction. Mossad and the CIA are masters of controlling the narrative around their actions through silence, careful cover, or strategic, often delayed, unofficial leaks. This really highlights the challenge for the public. The truth often emerges only in fragments, sometimes years later, filtered through these unofficial channels. It makes critical thinking absolutely paramount in navigating this complex information landscape.
We've seen the ingenuity, the operational effectiveness of these joint actions, but they don't happen in a vacuum, do they? They exist in these immense legal and ethical gray zones. Let's start with the legal frameworks. How do U.S. and Israeli laws actually govern these kinds of covert operations, especially when they team up?
Yeah, this is where it gets incredibly complex and frankly where a lot of the strategic maneuvering happens. Both agencies operate under very different national legal systems.
How so for the U.S.?
In the U.S., covert actions, especially lethal ones, are supposed to be governed by pretty strict laws and executive orders. Executive Order 12333, for example, explicitly bans assassinations by U.S. personnel.
Bans them outright. So how did Mugnia happen?
Right. It means for a lethal mission like Mugnia, the CIA needed a formal presidential finding. This finding declared Mugnia a legitimate, imminent threat, authorizing deadly force. President Bush issued one. Top U.S. lawyers signed off, framing it as national self-defense. This is based on a post-9/11 legal interpretation that views high-level terrorists as lawful military targets, even outside traditional battlefields. And crucially, these findings have to be reported to congressional intelligence committees. There's meant to be oversight, even if it's highly classified.
Okay, that's the U.S. side. But Israel seems to have a much more, shall we say, flexible approach, less constrained, maybe.
That seems fair to say. Mossad's mandate is far more secretive, coming directly from the prime minister. Israel doesn't have a public legislated ban on assassination. In fact, targeted killing has been an overt, acknowledged part of Israeli counterterrorism policy for decades. Their courts have even supported its legality in specific contexts, like active combat.
So no need for a finding or congressional report?
Generally, no.
Mm.
While Israel's High Court set some guidelines back in 2006 about necessity, proportionality in combat zones, it's not an outright ban. Mossad operates under classified orders, with much less parliamentary scrutiny compared to the theoretically rigorous oversight Congress is supposed to provide in the U.S.
Okay, so you have these two different legal systems. When the CIA and Mossad work together, how do they square that circle? Sounds like a recipe for legal friction or maybe some very creative legal interpretations.
It absolutely is. The CIA has to be extremely careful. It doesn't look like it's outsourcing actions that are forbidden under U.S. law to an ally. That would be seen as an illegal workaround. This is exactly why you see that intricate role splitting in the Mumia case. U.S. builds the bomb. Israel detonates it. Technically, no U.S. person pulled the trigger.
But is that distinction really meaningful? Legally?
Well, it's contentious. Some international law experts argue that even that approach is problematic. They might argue a car bomb assassination itself could be seen as perfidious under the laws of war, a treacherous killing tactic, like using a fake surrender flag. It blurs important lines.
And what about the basic issue of sovereignty? These operations often happen in places like Syria or Iran without permission. Isn't that just a straightforward violation of international law?
That's a huge international law problem. When U.S. or Israeli agents operate inside a third country like Syria, Iran, Lebanon, without that country's consent, yes, fundamentally they are breaching national sovereignty. The Mugnia hit in Damascus is a perfect example.
But they argue self-defense, right?
They might invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter, self-defense, claiming the target was planning imminent attacks. But those arguments often exist in a very contested legal gray area. And the secrecy, the fact these operations are usually unacknowledged, politically kind of mutes these legal violations. But they remain violations. If these actions were openly admitted, they'd likely face widespread international condemnation. That plausible deniability is their primary shield against legal and diplomatic fallout.
Okay, beyond the strict laws, there are massive ethical dilemmas here. How do intelligence agencies even justify things like targeted killings without trial, especially coming from democracies that prize due process?
This is a deeply debated, constantly churning ethical area. Democracies are built on due process, rule of law, accountability. Yet intelligence agencies often operate in secret, effectively acting as judge, jury, and executioner. The justification usually offered is utilitarian. Assassinating a key terrorist leader, they argue, saves innocent lives down the line by preventing future attacks. That was the argument for Mugnia.
But the counter-argument, the slippery slope.
Exactly. Critics warn, once you normalize extrajudicial killing, where does it stop? There's always the risk of bad intelligence, mistaken identity, There's the risk of collateral damage, killing innocent bystanders, and there's the risk of the definition of terrorist expanding over time, leading to wrongful deaths.
And even when they aim for precision, like with the Mugnia bomb, there are still risks to bystanders, aren't there?
Absolutely. Even with that controlled blast radius, critics point out that detonating any bomb on a public street is inherently risky, potentially indiscriminate.
Mm-hmm.
It uses methods similar to the very terrorists being targeted. That raises really tough ethical questions about proportionality, about acceptable risk, especially for agencies acting in the name of democratic values.
Another ethical minefield seems to be truth and deception, particularly false flag operations. Our sources mention this really alarming case where Mossad agents allegedly pretended to be CIA officers.
Yes, that was a highly controversial and ethically dubious incident. Reports surfaced in 2012, based on investigative journalism, that Mossad agents had allegedly posed as CIA officers when recruiting militants from a Pakistani group called Jundallah
Recruiting them to do what?
to carry out attacks inside Iran. And the crucial point is, they reportedly did this without CIA approval or even knowledge.
Wow, so they weren't just deceiving the militants, but also potentially setting up the U.S.
Precisely. It was an ethical breach on multiple levels. It risked severely damaging U.S. credibility, especially with Pakistan. It risked American lives if Iran retaliated, genuinely believing the CIA was behind these attacks. According to the sources, U.S. officials were, quote, furious. President Bush was described as absolutely ballistic. It jeopardized trust with a key partner, Pakistan, and directly contradicted stated U.S. policy toward Iran. It's a stark example of how even between allies, unilateral covert actions can cross ethical lines and create major conflict.
It boils down to that classic ends versus means debate, doesn't it? Does the goal justify the methods, however questionable?
It really does. Intelligence agencies often operate with a pragmatic mindset. They might justify actions, assassination, sabotage, deception, even partnering with pretty unsavory groups if they genuinely believe it prevents a greater harm, like a massive terror attack or a country getting nuclear weapons. But that pragmatic view often clashes head-on with the ethical expectations in democratic societies.
Like partnering with groups known for human rights abuses.
Exactly. Both the CIA and Mossad have, at times, allied with regimes or militias with terrible human rights records, simply because they shared a common enemy at that moment. Iran-Contra is a prime example again, facilitating funds to the Contras, who are widely accused of atrocities. It raises profound questions about moral complicity, about whether such alliances ultimately taint the values that democracies claim to uphold.
And what about privacy? Civil liberties. The Edward Snowden leaks brought a lot of that to the forefront, particularly regarding intelligence sharing between allies.
That's another huge ethical concern, one that directly impacts ordinary citizens. The Snowden leaks in 2013 revealed the NSA was sharing raw communications intercepts with Israel. This included potentially data on U.S. citizens. And it was done under an agreement described as not legally binding.
Not legally binding, so based purely on trust.
Essentially, yes. Based on Israeli promises not to misuse the data. This raised immediate alarms about whether safeguards were strong enough to protect individual rights. Could Americans' private communications end up in the hands of a foreign service, like Israel's Unit 8200, which operates under different laws and with less public accountability? Even U.S. intelligence officials reportedly worried about this, with one admitting that friendly services like Israel could be a threat if they misuse shared data, perhaps acting in ways the U.S. itself wouldn't, like targeting someone based on that intel. It shows how the drive for security can clash with personal freedoms, raising big ethical questions about unchecked power.
With all this secrecy baked in, what are the real challenges for oversight and accountability? Especially when you have two powerful agencies working together, it sounds like things could easily fall through the cracks.
It's inherently difficult. Covert operations are designed to avoid scrutiny. And when two countries collaborate secretly, accountability can become even more diffuse, almost lost between national jurisdictions. Both the U.S. and Israel struggle to ensure their joint activities get proper oversight from their legislatures or are subject to public accountability.
So even though Congress is supposed to oversee the CIA, these foreign partnerships can create workarounds.
Potentially, yes.
Oh.
In theory, Congress gets briefed on covert actions via those classified findings. But working with foreign partners can create, let's say, ambiguities. Our sources note that these intelligence liaison relationships have often escaped the reach of congressional oversight. Well, if Israel takes the lead on an operation, and the U.S. role is seen as minor, indirect, maybe just providing support like building the bomb for Mugnia, The executive branch might argue it doesn't meet the threshold for a formal covert action finding or doesn't require a full briefing to Congress. Iran-Contra is the historical poster child for this Israel acting as a surrogate arms dealer, effectively helping the Reagan administration bypass the Boland Amendment limits set by Congress. The full details only came out years later after investigations, fueling that political dismay in the U.S. about secret government actions. It shows how joint ops can be used, intentionally or not, to sidestep domestic legal checks.
And in Israel, oversight of Mossad is even weaker, isn't it? Which makes joint accountability even harder.
Significantly weaker, yes. Mossad reports directly to the prime minister. Parliamentary scrutiny in the Knesset is historically very limited. There's a subcommittee on intelligence, but its powers are constrained and much remains secret under broad national security claims. So, when Mossad works with the CIA, its actions aren't reported to the U.S. Congress, and the CIA's role might not be fully disclosed to the Knesset. You get this kind of double layer of secrecy, making comprehensive accountability almost impossible for citizens in either country.
And this plays right into plausible deniability again. If something goes wrong, they can just blame each other or deny knowing the full picture.
Precisely. If an operation gets exposed or fails disastrously, each side can potentially claim it was the other guy's initiative or deny they knew all the details. Responsibility gets diffused. The foreign partner acts as a convenient cutout. U.S. officials could truthfully say, no American pulled the trigger in Damascus, while omitting the crucial support role. Israeli officials could downplay U.S. help back home. It makes pinning down blame incredibly difficult.
And the Snowden leaks exposed another facet of this oversight gap, specifically on data sharing.
Absolutely. Snowden revealed that massive sharing of raw intercepts with Israel was happening under this not legally binding agreement, relying solely on Israeli assurances. This arrangement wasn't widely known even within parts of the government, let alone Congress or the public. It raised huge questions about data misuse, about protecting citizen privacy when intelligence is shared so freely between allies with different rules. The public, and many in Congress, only learned about it because of a leak, not through any formal accountability channel. It really highlights how these joint covert arrangements challenge traditional checks and balances, creating that democratic deficit and feeding into the political dismay citizens feel when they realize how much happens in the shadows.
Okay, so we've established this incredibly deep, unparalleled collaboration, but it's definitely not always smooth sailing, is it? There are clearly conflicts, moments where agendas diverge, straining the relationship. What are some examples where political differences caused friction in the intelligence cooperation?
No, it's certainly not unconditional harmony. Political and strategic disagreements between the U.S. and Israeli governments definitely spill over and create tension within the intelligence partnership. A good historical example comes from the late 1980s concerning the PLO.
The Palestine Liberation Organization.
Right. In 1988, the Reagan administration decided to open a dialogue with Yasser Arafat's PLO, provided Arafat renounced terrorism. The CIA was then tasked with monitoring if the PLO was actually complying.
Okay.
But the Israeli government at the time, led by Yitzhak Shamir, was totally opposed to legitimizing the PLO. They saw them purely as terrorists. So suddenly you had Mossad, dedicated to fighting the PLO, and the CIA, now tasked with engaging diplomatically with the PLO.
That puts them in an awkward spot, potentially adversarial even.
Exactly. It created real concerns about how they would interpret intelligence data related to the PLO, potential arguments, maybe even withholding sensitive information from each other because their political masters had diverging goals.
And what about more recently, especially around Iran policy? Both countries want to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons, but they don't always agree on how, right? That must cause friction.
Oh, major friction at times. Despite that shared top-level goal, no nuclear Iran, the tactical approaches can diverge dramatically. Take 2012, for instance. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was reportedly seriously considering unilateral military strikes against Iran's nuclear sites,
Well, the EU what?
while the Obama administration was heavily pushing for diplomacy, which eventually led to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So you have this period of intense pressure, public leaks, and counter-leaks. U.S. officials worrying Israel might launch a strike without warning, Israel worrying the U.S. diplomacy might undermine their covert efforts or give Iran too much leeway. It highlights a persistent tension in how they approach Iran, a tension that continues to shape the region today, impacting everything from Syria to Gaza.
The sources also bring up those rogue operations by Mossad again, like the Jindallah false flag recruitment we talked about. That clearly went beyond just disagreement. It actively angered the U.S.
That was a really serious point of conflict. From the CIA's viewpoint, Mossad agents pretending to be Americans to recruit Pakistani militants to attack Iran.
Yeah.
That was completely unacceptable.
Why specifically?
Well, it endangered U.S. interests in Pakistan, a very sensitive relationship. It directly contradicted U.S. policy. The U.S. wasn't engaged in that kind of proxy war against Iran. And it put American lives at risk if Iran retaliated based on false information. Sources say President Bush was absolutely ballistic. The CIA was reportedly furious at what they saw as Mossad, acting unilaterally with profound disregard for U.S. concerns. It's a prime example of one partner pursuing its own specific agenda in this case, pressuring Iran through proxies without the other's buy-in, causing major friction and straining that fundamental trust.
Has it ever gone the other way? Has the U.S. taken intelligence actions that Israel disliked or put pressure on Israeli operations?
Yes, it has happened. For example, back in the early 90s during the Oslo peace process, the CIA started cooperating directly with the Palestinian Authority's new security forces, sharing intelligence, helping build them up to counter Hamas.
And Israel wasn't happy about that.
Some Israeli officials were definitely uneasy. They saw it as the U.S. potentially strengthening forces that could, down the line, pose a threat to Israel or undermine their own security operations in the territories. Another really prominent example was in 1997. Mossad botched an attempt to poison Hamas leader Khaled Mashal in Amman, Jordan.
Right, the antidote incident.
Exactly. The Clinton administration put immense pressure on Israel to provide the antidote to save Mashal's life. The U.S. was deeply worried about the regional fallout, about relations with Jordan. They publicly condemned the assassination attempt, a rare and very direct rebuke that created significant tension behind closed doors. It showed there were limits to what the U.S. would tolerate, even from a close ally.
So despite all these clashes, these moments of deep frustration, the alliance holds. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, spying on allies. There's clearly an underlying trust deficit. The Jonathan Pollard case is probably the most notorious example of this.
Oh, the Pollard case is absolutely the textbook example of this uncomfortable reality. Jonathan Pollard was a civilian analyst working for U.S. naval intelligence in the mid-1980s. He stole vast quantities, thousands of highly classified U.S. documents, and sold them to Israel.
Spying for Israel from inside U.S. intelligence.
Exactly. His arrest in 1985 sent shockwaves through the American security establishment. It exposed a really aggressive Israeli espionage operation targeting its closest ally. The damage was immense, exposing U.S. sources, methods, capabilities. Pollard got a life sentence. And it poisoned relations for years.
How did that happen? Why was he able to steal so much?
Well, sources suggest U.S. counterintelligence might have been held back, perhaps reluctant to aggressively investigate a close ally due to political sensitivities. Israel's handlers apparently exploited this reluctance. The whole affair created this deep sense of betrayal within the CIA and FBI, and afterward, the CIA became much more cautious about sharing its most sensitive intelligence with Israel. Even as recently as 2013, declassified documents apparently still listed Israel as a top counterintelligence concern, right alongside rivals like Russia and China. It definitely contributes to that sense of political dismay within the U.S. intel community. Can you ever fully trust even your closest partners?
And it's not just Israel spying on the U.S., right? The U.S. spies on Israel, too. It suggests a kind of trust but verify approach is standard practice, even between friends.
Oh, absolutely not a one-way street. The U.S. has a long history of gathering intelligence on Israel, particularly concerning its suspected nuclear program at Dimona and its military intentions. Back in the 60s, the U.S. flew U-2 spy planes over Dimona.
Really? U-2s over Israel?
Yes. And more recently, the Snowden leaks suggested NSA surveillance targeted allied leaders. And there were credible reports the U.S. monitored communications of Israeli officials, especially during those tense negotiations over the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. It's very much trust but verify on both sides.
There were even those unconfirmed reports about Israel planting listening devices near the White House.
Right. Those reports surfaced around 2010. Israel vehemently denied it, and the U.S. never made a formal accusation. But many within the U.S. intelligence world found it plausible, given Israel's known aggressive intelligence collection efforts. In fact, a leaked NSA memo reportedly warned explicitly that Israel aggressively seeks to spy on the U.S. government, contrasting it with a more trusted Five Eyes partners.
So what's the bottom line here? You have these breaches, clear distrust, moments of outright betrayal, yet they keep working together closely. How do we make sense of that?
Well, connecting it all, it means that despite the spying, despite the suspicion, both the U.S. and Israel have incredibly powerful incentives to just manage the friction and keep the cooperation going. For Israel, the benefits of U.S. intelligence, The global reach, the tech, the diplomatic muscle are simply too valuable to give up. And for the U.S., Israel's unique regional insights, their human networks in the Middle East, their operational capabilities, they're too valuable to lose, especially with ongoing threats from Iran, terrorist groups, and regional instability affecting places like Gaza.
So they just accept the uncomfortable underbelly.
Pretty much. They pragmatically manage it. Each side almost certainly runs counterintelligence operations against the other, acknowledging the reality of allied espionage, but they try not to let it completely derail the broader strategic partnership that benefits both. It's a powerful reminder that in the world of intelligence, shared strategic interests often outweigh the need for absolute trust.
Let's talk about the global impact. These joint operations, especially the pioneering ones, have set some really significant precedents, haven't they? Particularly in cyber warfare.
Without question. Stuxnet Operation Olympic Games is universally recognized as the first cyber attack known to cause physical damage. By jointly creating and unleashing this weapon against Iran's nuclear program, the U.S. and Israel effectively introduced a brand new form of statecraft, a new domain of warfare, and that precedent sent ripples worldwide. It essentially fired the starting gun for a global cyber arms race.
How so?
Because other nations immediately saw the potential. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they all dramatically ramped up their own offensive cyber programs in the years following Stuxnet's discovery.
And we're seeing the consequences of that now directly in conflicts like the one between Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely. Stuxnet blurred the lines about what constitutes an active war in cyberspace, moving beyond just espionage into actual physical destruction. Russia has used cyber attacks extensively against Ukraine, hitting critical infrastructure, government systems, military networks, often alongside their conventional attacks. It demonstrates how the U.S.-Israeli pioneering of Stuxnet arguably made these tactics more thinkable, maybe more acceptable, for all state actors.
Right.
It legitimized this new domain of conflict, raising critical questions about cyber warfare norms that we're still grappling with today.
And what about targeted killings? That practice seems to have become more normalized too, partly due to U.S. and Israeli actions setting precedents.
Yes, that's another area. Israel's long history of targeted killings was often heavily criticized internationally. But there was a noticeable shift after 9/11 when the U.S. adopted similar tactics, most famously with drone strikes against al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders. The joint Moghyan killing in 2008 further signaled U.S. willingness to engage in targeted killings outside recognized war zones.
And this has eroded international norms.
You could argue it has. It's made targeted killing a more accepted, though still highly controversial tool for some states. What's particularly concerning is how authoritarian regimes have watched this. Russia, for example, has brazenly poisoned or assassinated opponents abroad. While their justifications differ, they sometimes use language about eliminating terrorists or enemies of the state that echoes the rationales used by the U.S. and Israel. This potentially allows them to claim a veneer of legitimacy for their own actions, contributing to a global erosion of respect for international law and due process.
How have these joint operations affected the actual geopolitical balance in the Middle East?
Well, specific operations have had lasting impacts. That support for the Kurds in the 70s, followed by their abandonment, that created a deep legacy of mistrust among Kurdish groups towards external powers, which still affects U.S.-Kurdish relations today. Iran-Contra, when exposed, arguably strengthened Iranian hardliners, providing proof of U.S.-Israeli collusion, even while ironically involving arms sales to Iran. It also complicated America's standing when arguing for non-proliferation or rule of law elsewhere. On the other hand, you could argue that the quiet intelligence sharing between Israel and some Gulf Arab states, driven largely by shared concerns about Iran, helped pave the way for the Abraham Accords normalization agreements.
But there have been positive precedents too, right, in terms of effectively stopping threats.
Certainly. This close intelligence cooperation has, arguably, shown how two allies can effectively integrate their capabilities. This has led to genuine successes in disrupting terrorist networks like al-Qaeda or ISIS affiliates, which benefits global security. Their joint efforts in counter-proliferation, like exposing or delaying nuclear programs in places like Syria or Iran, have been welcomed, albeit quietly, by many other nations who share the concerns but lack the means or will to act themselves. So it might encourage more behind-the-scenes multilateral intelligence sharing on really tough global problems.
Okay, finally, let's touch on public perceptions. How do adversaries in particular use these joint operations in their propaganda, both at home and abroad?
In the public mind, especially across the Middle East, Mossad and the CIA often take on this almost mythical status, omnipotent conspirators pulling strings behind the scenes. Joint operations feed into these narratives, sometimes confirming suspicions, sometimes wildly distorting reality for propaganda gains.
Like the Iranian narrative, they seem to frequently blame U.S.-Israeli plots for internal problems.
That's a constant theme in their state media, absolutely.
Mm.
The Iranian regime routinely blames protests, assassinations of nuclear scientists, cyber attacks, pretty much anything that goes wrong, on joint American-Israeli plots. After a nuclear scientist, Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan, was killed in 2012, Ayatollah Khamenei publicly blamed the CIA and Mossad.
Why? What's the goal of that narrative?
It reinforces their message that the great Satan, America, and the little Satan, Israel, are constantly conspiring against Iran. It's designed to rally domestic support, deflect blame for internal failings, and justify their own retaliatory actions, whether overt or covert. They even launch propaganda lawsuits blaming the U.S. and Israel. U.S. denials are just dismissed as disinformation. This narrative battle directly shapes the ongoing tensions with Iran and influences political dynamics across the region.
And this feeds into wider conspiracy theories, too, in the broader Arab world among terror groups.
Definitely. Decades of conflict and covert action have created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Some are outlandish, like claims Mossad was behind 9/11, or that the CIA and Mossad created ISIS. But the fact that the CIA and Mossad do secretly cooperate gives these theories a kernel of perceived truth, even when the conclusions are completely wrong. This makes U.S. public diplomacy very difficult, as genuine democratic movements can be easily dismissed as CIA-Mossad puppets. And terror groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS exploit this too. They portray any setback as proof of the mighty Crusader Zionist intelligence enemy, which helps recruitment and rationalizes their own violence.
This really underscores the challenge for you, the listener, trying to sort fact from fiction, especially in conflicts like Gaza, where information itself is clearly being weaponized.
It absolutely does. The sheer volume of accusations, some based on partial truths, some pure fabrication, creates this incredibly dense fog. It makes it extremely difficult for anyone to distinguish genuine intelligence operations from deliberate disinformation campaigns. It just reinforces how vital critical thinking is, how important it is to seek out credible, fact-based reporting, especially when information itself is such a central part of the conflict.
Which brings us to a really fundamental question for democracies like the U.S. What is the actual cost of all this secrecy? How do these deep, far-reaching covert alliances challenge core principles like transparency and accountability?
It's a core challenge. The very existence of extensive secret alliances like the Mossad CIA partnership pushes against the ideal of open, accountable government. Citizens, and often even their elected representatives, are kept in the dark about actions taken in their name, actions funded by their taxes that could have huge consequences.
Like getting entangled in conflicts.
Exactly. Entanglement in unforeseen conflicts, undermining stated foreign policy goals, maybe even violating international law. When these things happen in secret, the public has no say. And while some secrecy is obviously necessary for national security, prolonged secrecy, or worse, outright deception, inevitably corrodes public trust when the truth eventually comes out. It fuels that political dismay we sometimes see in the USA.
Iran-Contra feels like the ultimate cautionary tale here, doesn't it?
It's a perfect example of the dangers. Iran-Contra demonstrated vividly how secret cooperation, in that case with Israel and others, was used to deliberately subvert Congress's constitutional power over funding, and involves lying to the public. The massive scandal that followed severely damaged trust in the presidency, led to calls for reform, and left that lasting scar of political dismay about executive overreach and secret government actions. It forces us to ask, how much should citizens accept not knowing? And who really ensures these powerful agencies stay within legal and ethical bounds when operating in secret? As we've seen, these foreign liaison relationships can sometimes slip through the cracks of even established oversight mechanisms, creating a real democratic deficit.
And this is exactly where investigative journalism becomes so incredibly important, right? They act as the public's eyes and ears on this secret state, often taking big risks to do so.
They are absolutely vital. Indispensable, really. When official information is deliberately hidden or spun, investigative reporters are often the only way these hidden truths come to light. They rely on confidential sources, painstaking research, cross-referencing tiny details. It's difficult, often thankless work, and it frequently puts them in conflict with governments who might accuse them of harming national security.
But without them.
Without them, the public would likely never hear about major events like Stuxnet or the Mughia assassination or the full extent of NSA Israel data sharing. or at least not in a truthful, comprehensive way.
Mm.
Their work provides the raw material for accountability.
And connecting back to that idea of Sinwar's alleged lives for video strategy, if information and perception are now battlegrounds themselves, doesn't that make the journalist's pursuit of independent truth even more critical for democracy?
It absolutely does. If information itself is a weapon, as that chilling strategy suggests, then the independent, rigorous pursuit of truth by journalists becomes an essential defense mechanism for a functioning democracy. They face huge challenges, sorting fact from sophisticated disinformation, avoiding manipulation by sources with hidden agendas, sometimes facing physical danger. That's why protecting press freedom, including strong whistleblower protections and resisting the overclassification of information, is so crucial. It acts as a vital check on excessive secrecy. The Snowden leaks, for example, ignited a necessary public and congressional debate about privacy and surveillance that simply wouldn't have happened otherwise. Democracy is stronger for that awareness.
What about the broader public? Do people have a right to know about these secret actions taken in their name? Is there such a thing as informed consent when it comes to covert operations?
It's a difficult balance. Obviously, not every operational detail can or should be public in real time. But Democratic leaders do have a fundamental responsibility, I think, to ensure that the broad strokes of their covert strategy align with the nation's values and the public's general understanding.
Because if things go wrong, the public pays the price.
Exactly. If covert operations backfire, lead to unintended wars, diplomatic crises, or erode the country's moral standing, it's the public that ultimately bears the consequences. They bear those consequences without ever having had a chance to voice approval or concern beforehand. That's why fostering public discussion, not necessarily about specific ongoing ops, but about the principles guiding covert action, using historical examples brought to light by journalists, is so important for a healthy democracy. The public debate in the U.S. over drone strike policy in the 2010s is a good example. Revelations led to debate, which led to the Obama administration eventually outlining a public framework for lethal force. That kind of dialogue is essential.
And finally, what about the impact on international norms? If Western democracies engage in secret practices that seem to bend or break international law, what signal does that send globally, especially to authoritarian regimes?
This is a critical point, impacting global credibility. If democracies like the U.S. and Israel are seen, even secretly, engaging in practices like sovereignty violations or targeted assassinations that arguably contravene international law, it inherently weakens those norms for everyone. Because authoritarian regimes think Russia, China, others can readily point to these precedents, even if unofficially acknowledged, to justify their own abuses. They might justify actions in places like Ukraine or crackdowns on dissidents abroad by saying effectively, look, the CIA and Mossad do similar things, why can't we? It creates a kind of whataboutism that undermines efforts to uphold international law. This can boomerang, potentially endangering journalists or activists overseas who can then be targeted under the guise of counterterrorism using justifications normalized by Western actions. So democratic oversight of secret operations isn't just about domestic accountability. It's crucial for maintaining global leadership and credibility and promoting the rule of law and human rights worldwide. It's about ensuring our own actions don't inadvertently undermine the very values we claim to defend. Hashtag outro.
So what we've really unpacked today is this deep, persistent paradox, isn't it? The Mossad CIA partnership. It's undeniably effective, often crucial in protecting national security for both the U.S. and Israel. But at the same time, it frequently, maybe inherently, challenges the very democratic principles, transparency, accountability, rule of law that it's supposed to be protecting.
It's a constant tension, an enduring challenge, that delicate, often really precarious balance between security and liberty. The shadows these operations need to function effectively are the same shadows that can hide crucial information from the public, creating this fundamental conflict for any democratic society.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? Well, maybe it means recognizing the sheer scale of power that's wielded behind these closed doors. Understanding the critical importance of staying informed, of asking tough questions, in an age where information itself is undeniably a weapon, where, as some of our sources chillingly suggest, even suicide can become a tool for narrative control. How do democracies make sure their own secret actions don't end up undermining the very values they're sworn to uphold? How do they create space for the complex, often uncomfortable truth to eventually find its way out? It's a question that echoes far beyond the world of spies and secret agents, right into the heart of how our societies function.
Absolutely. We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. We encourage you to keep digging, stay curious, and always approach the narratives presented to you wherever they come from with a critical eye.
Join us next time on The Deep Dive.